Hello and welcome to our second complex trauma training session. My name is Stephanie Hilfer, Senior Clinical Psychologist. Thank you for coming back. So our first session was all about fundamentals of complex trauma, particularly focusing on theory from neuroscience perspective. And we talked about how it is that attachment impacts the developing brain, particularly the areas underpinning emotion regulation, and why it is then through neuroscience that we can better understand a lot of these behaviors and presentations that we see in a lot of young people that have had complex trauma histories. So for today, we want to talk about, or what I want to talk about today is how do we translate a lot of this theory into practice? What has worked for me? So this isn't about telling you what to do. I'm not about that at all, because I don't know that everything that I do is the right thing to do. I want to share with you and acknowledge that working with these kids is so incredibly difficult, and we are constantly on our toes trying to figure out how to engage them, how to make changes, what is the latest research. So I want to share that with you. And it's not to say this is how you have to do things. Some of the things I'm going to say you might completely disagree with. In fact, this isn't necessarily how I was trained. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today happens within relationships, and understanding how developing a relationship can be so powerful, and it is. And I'm comfortable with that now. I probably wasn't comfortable with that in the past, and maybe some academics out there are still not comfortable with that. But what I'm going to try to demonstrate to you as much as I can is that neuroscience is now proving that a lot of these strategies can be extremely helpful and helping us understand why. So for today's training session, I would recommend this. It's a really nice book. I've read it a few times. It's all about neurobiology, how that affects attachment, and how that we can translate that into a practice. Just before we get started, I do want to remind everyone of the 3 pillars of trauma-informed care. I want you to think about these pillars as I continue to discuss different ways in which we can engage and offer treatment to young people in a trauma-informed way, and how each of these relate back to these 3 pillars. And the first pillar is creating safety. Creating safety in their environments, in our therapeutic environments, in our relationships is really important. The second pillar is connections and relationships. These also form part of trauma-informed care. And lastly, helping them develop emotion regulation. That is a third pillar. So the 3 things that we'll always think through in terms of what approaches we use with young people with complex trauma need to include safety, connections and relationships, and emotion regulation, affect regulation. Okay, let's begin. We need to remember what part of the brain is activated when the brain is traumatized, because that is the part of the brain that we need to communicate with. So the part of the brain that is activated when that person, that adolescent, is threatened is the brainstem, the survival brain, the animal brain. It's not the thinking brain, which is the part of the brain that is activated in us when we're talking, when we're learning, right? It is a different part of the brain. The part of the brain that is activated when the brain is traumatized is not the neocortex. It is not the higher order thinking brain. It is the brainstem. It is the survival brain. And this itself justifies why a lot of our interventions need to be targeted to the brainstem. The brainstem speaks only the language of sensations. It understands the tone of voice. It understands your facial expressions, sensory profiling and interventions with sensory toys, weighted blankets, all those things, as opposed to how would you engage with someone at a higher thinking level, which is what we would normally probably do, as therapists, which is what we know how to do when we talk about emotions and problem solve and all that's all higher thinking stuff. So This is the very first thing that we need to remember, because when we try to engage a young person or anyone who's traumatized at a thinking level, which is the language that we're speaking, right, we lose them. We need to remember, and we need to try to engage bottom up approaches to therapy. We need to consider these in therapeutic work with children, with adults, before we can even consider introducing higher level strategies like cognitive strategies. So working on a secure relationship, trying to experience and developing moments of attunement with the young person, being available during emotional dysregulation, that is so important, because you being the external co-regulator of affect, this is very powerful. Our ability to repair misattunements, again, it's very powerful, because you're also helping that young person learn that you are a safe person, that they can rely on you, that they can trust you, so that when they are ready to go into those deep affects, they know that you can regulate them. This is all about regulation. This is what the brainstem's all about. Regulate them out of that affect, out of that situation. You can focus on physiological symptoms to encourage the downregulation of the brainstem and brainstem driven responses. Often when we see a child who's not sleeping, who's constantly running away, these are all brainstem behaviors. We need to remember to stay at the same wavelength. And what you'll see, or what I have seen, is that on some days, and they feel safe and they've had a good week or so, they come in and they talk, and you can actually connect with them at a higher thinking level, at a cognitive level. We can do a lot of the beautiful things we've been trained in. And then for the next 2 weeks, they come in and they're at another level. And that's okay. You need to be adaptable. You need to be flexible. I loved manuals as a therapist. We love our books. Actually, I have so many here at home that I don't use anymore, because it was session 1 you do this, session 2 you do this, session 3 you do that. And there was so much comfort and safety in knowing what you do each session. And it was almost like the client had to adapt to me, because I felt safe with that. You got to go for the ride, and you don't know what's going to happen. And that's what life is like for them. So 1 week you're going to feel like you've progressed and you've done so much. And then, the next week you're back at brainstem level, and that's okay. You just need to know how to ride that wave, how to pick up on the cues that they're telling you about where they're at. So rocking, for example, like, that's very soothing to the animal brain. If a child starts to rock, then okay, so they're not feeling, they're not okay. They're beginning to dysregulate, and that's when through your external co-regulation, will then take over and say, I'm just wondering, if maybe what we're talking about is a little bit too hard for you. I'm worried. I might be wrong. I don't know. You own it. I don't know, but maybe we'll leave it at that for today. How about that? Maybe we'll take it. We're not gonna go there today. I don't think it's a good idea. How soothing that is for that animal brain to know that you are very respectful, that you have taken a step back, that you have identified probably what they had no insight, right? That they had no insight, that they weren't coping with it, or that it was becoming overwhelming for them, and you've nipped it in the bud, really, because you've identified it early on. And you don't even have to teach them. You can just show them, this is what happens when you have anxiety, and through your relationship, through that behavior, you can actually start to identify times when that client has gone from say thinking brain mode to animal brain mode. But this is well into therapy. This is when you've been able to talk about some things and to get into some difficult topics, but very, very early on. None of this is going to happen. I mean, maybe it will, I don't know, but with a lot of the incredibly dysregulated kids that I see, it doesn't happen for a little while. It doesn't happen, and I mean, why would it? These are pretty awful things, right, that they don't yet trust you enough to help them regulate themselves out of that affect when in fact they are ready to talk to you about that. So at the very beginning, if we start and we go straight in there with a thinking brain mode, which is where we're at, because we're ready, we're going to go in this, we're going to do this, we're going to help you, and we do it using our thinking brain techniques. What are we actually doing? What is it that we're doing when we begin to demand thinking brain behavior when a child or a patient, an adolescent, adult is at the survival brain level? What happens when we demand thinking brain behavior from the animal brain? We'll have a look at this slide. It's actually pretty scary. We're agitating the animal brain. We are poking at the animal brain. We are increasing arousal, and they just don't know how to self-regulate. We are not speaking its language when we ask neocortex behavior or neocortex understanding from a child who is brainstem driven. It's not that the neocortex is not developed, but the sophisticated skills, the consequences, the planning, that's not on board yet. This is where we lose kids in therapy. We lose kids' engagement in casework or in treatment because we're not on their wavelength. Being engaged means that the young person is not bouncing off walls, being over-aroused, or in the I can't, what's the point zone, so they're under-aroused. Remember, self-regulation is important for engagement, and how we communicate to them will impact their arousal. We need to learn to listen and stay at their wavelength, wherever that takes you. So today, they can deal with it. Tomorrow, they don't want a bar of it. And that's okay. It is you who needs to move along with that and ride that wave with them. It's not them who need to adapt to you. It's not waiting for them to be ready. It's you to ride the wave with them for wherever it is that they're at. We can't wait. And I hear this from a lot of people that want to work with these kids. They're not ready. They're not ready. They're not ready. I understand what you're trying to say, and I understand that they're not ready. And look, some of them aren't even ready for a relationship, and I get that. But some of us are saying they're not ready. They're not ready for what we have to offer, and what we have to offer is neocortex based, neocortex driven. A lot of these kids are ready for brainstem interventions, which are incredibly therapeutic. We can do a lot of work with these kids if we agree and know how to ride their wavelength. When we see a lot of these kids and they respond in these chaotic ways, it is actually very natural for them to respond in these ways. We're very shocked and we're very upset by what we see, but given what they've gone through, it is very natural. Abuse situations of any kind that absolutely terrorize us. Any experience that is perceived as life-threatening, right? Your life was in danger. You thought you were going to die. Your safety was at stake. All these situations, all these abuse situations, that is arousal that you carry with you unless you process it. And you are not going to process that arousal unless you feel safe. So if you want to have access to all the goodness of that thinking brain, all the goodness of the neocortex, you really need to communicate with that brainstem, communicate with the survival brain, communicate safety. It is not until that part of the brain feels safe that you will have access to other parts of the brain. So why are these kids at this brainstem level constantly? What is it about their experience? It just seems that they are constantly at this brainstem, over-aroused, incredibly dysregulated, very aggressive level. This is absolute chaos when you look at this slide. Absolute chaos. And this is the best when I was looking through pictures, the best I could come up with, about what the world actually looks like. If you could picture what the world looks like symbolically, this is probably the best representation of what the world looks like. This is what we know about trauma. In cases of threat, the amygdala sends its message to the brain stem to activate the fight or flight response, and it also sends a message to the neocortex to shut down. Why would it do that? Because we don't want the neocortex to talk us out of fighting for our lives, right? We can't afford to do that because we are in real danger. The reality is that we are in real danger. So we don't want the neocortex talking us out of fighting for our survival. But in the context of extreme chronic trauma, eventually there is this accumulation of stress and trauma on the brain and the nervous system over time, and the young person's amygdala just doesn't stop sending fear signals to the brainstem, and it keeps the neocortex shut down. So think about these young people in chronically stressed conditions. Look at this picture and think about these kids. We talked about these kids having stresses that are greater than our everyday stresses. And their everyday stresses, their big everyday stresses, are not just big, they're massive, they're huge. So what are we talking about? We're talking about family contact with family who may have been perpetrators. Family that they might not get on with, or family who might be sick. We're talking about homelessness. We're talking about abuse, all the different types of abuse you can think of. Continued abuse, domestic violence, witnessing substance abuse, witnessing their parents suffer. Young people worried about their own physical safety. Young people worried about their siblings still living at home. Young people worried about, their parents being alive or dead, or awful things happening to them, the siblings being removed. There's just a whole lot of things that these kids are worried about on a daily basis. These are not natural experiences. We were not made to experience things that make us feel sheer terror. That is not what we were made for. It should not surprise us what these kids do, because they are in chronic dysregulated state and their environments are maintaining this state. If there is anything that the brainstem will respond to when it comes to words, because we've said that the brainstem doesn't understand the language of words, it understands the language of sensations. But when we do walk in and we talk to these kids, we use our words. And so every session, I will remind them from session 1 to however long I'm seeing them for. This is what I say. My goal for you is to feel safe. I do not compromise on your safety. Everything's negotiable, not your safety. Your safety is non-negotiable. Your safety is my priority. If there are any words that the brainstem understands, it is the word safe. Further to that though, how do we engage the animal brain? Through our senses. Through our senses. When I first started using a lot of these sensory toys, I remember walking into sessions with like a little luggage, and people would think I was an OT. And actually, I didn't really know. This is a very long time ago, and it just worked. It made sense to me. I knew about the animal brain. I knew about the thinking brain and sensations, but it's not what a clinical psychologist did back then anyway. We weren't as trauma informed as we are right now, but it just really worked. It was so soothing to the brain, and often what I would go in there and show them, this is some things that can help some kids feel a little bit better. And it's such a safe thing to do, because for the first session, a lot of these kids are waiting for you to say, what's the problem? Who did what to you? How are you feeling? Why did you punch that person in the face? That's not good. You know you can go to jail for that. But there I was turning up with these toys and saying, let's go through these and see which ones make you feel a little bit better. So we're not going to talk about problems. We're not going to talk about my emotions. We're not going to talk about why I've got caught tomorrow, unless you want to. Otherwise, let's come up with a sensory box for you, because they're pretty cool. It works. Makes you feel better. But you got to choose what works for you. Not everything works for everyone. And I guess you do have to be very careful, especially with those kids with sexual abuse, about some of the sensory toys that you are introducing to them. But chewy tubes, for example, a lot of my adolescents would love them because they would chew on them so much and sometimes pretend even that they're cigarettes. But you could just see, like, they destroy these toys, not deliberately because they're aggressive, but when they start to really get into talking about those situations or feelings or whatever it is, when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of therapy and they have the sensory box in front of them, they're just constantly, they're self-regulating, externally self-regulating through the brainstem through those toys, and it's actually very therapeutic, and it's really, really helpful. So we developed this sensory box because we want to communicate with the animal brain. Don't go in there, and I shouldn't tell you what to do, I apologize. I don't go in there expecting to discuss trauma and expecting to, engage and have them talk about a lot of really horrible things without giving them some skills to deal with the arousal associated with talking about those things. So we have to give them something. We have to do something that will at least help them deal with the arousal associated with it. So music is something else that is really soothing, and sometimes this can be, somewhat controversial. Pick the right music. You're not going to go in and listen to death music when they're suicidal, whatever death music is. But it's okay, I guess, to, music that makes them feel better, that is appropriate. Polyvagal Theory, I've read that book. I half understood it. It's a good book. I need to read it again. But it actually talks about, how it is that music can actually be very soothing and very helpful in healing. That's always been very, very helpful for me and the young people that we talk to. And I mean, if we think about our own experiences, music can really help you feel better when you're feeling down. It can, bring your mood up. You can connect. It can actually also be a point of discussion of, there's a particular song that makes them feel a particular way. There's a reason for that. Run with it. Talk about it. Listen to the lyrics. Try to understand the young person through music. Weighted materials are also really helpful. Some kids are okay to talk about some difficult things when they've got a weighted blanket on them. They feel that nervous system really feels that containment. It's actually really helpful, but it helps some kids, others it doesn't, and it's trial and error, and let them choose, let them tell you, let them be in control of what sort of sensory stimulation is going to help with their own regulation of arousal. So remember that be creative in engaging the animal brain. Use sensory toys. They speak the language of sensations, and it can be very soothing to the animal brain. We regulate affect through sensations. The animal brain responds well to sensations, to the tone of voice, to music, to sensory toys that lower the arousal of the nervous system. It's very similar to teaching children to regulate through sensations. Some people do it automatically when they rock. Rocking is very soothing. We do it ourselves when we're in meetings. We get fidgety. We get our own stress balls. These are things that really do help. Like I said before, this is why people might actually think that children are not ready for therapy. They're not engaging with us, we might say. But it really is that we are not engaging with them. It is our inability to recognize where they are at. They're at a brainstem survival level. We are at a neocortex level. We need to meet them at their level. And in this slide, I just have a little summary of, top-down versus bottom-up approaches. And basically what we would be doing is we would be approaching our client with complex trauma from bottom up. The rationale being that the part of the brain that is activated when the brain is traumatized is the animal brain. And if you want to have access to the beautiful functions of that cognitive processing brain, of that thinking brain, you really need that bottom-up approach. I want to show you this video. I find this video extremely helpful, particularly if you're going to talk or educate teachers, because it's one about school and creating safety. But the main message of the first thing that we need in responding to complex trauma is creating safety in whatever safe way that might be. Have a look at this video.
A learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again? Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain It's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn.
Moving on from identifying and acknowledging that the part of the brain that is activated when the brain is traumatized is the animal brain, and communicating safety and self-regulating sensory strategies to the animal brain. The next point I want to make in trying to engage and intervene with a lot of our young people is about developing relationships, about attunement, about empathy, and about the external co-regulation of affect. And what I mean by right brain to right brain communication, when I refer to it throughout this training session, is this ability to identify both conscious and unconscious affects beneath the words. We listen to the person, we listen to the narrative, but we need to listen beneath the words. We need to pay attention to implicit non-verbal communication. There is a lot that is said non-verbally. There's a lot that is said implicitly that we need to learn to pay attention to, because we miss this in a lot of there's a lot of information that is conveyed, and especially when we have this relationship, we really get misguided sometimes by just listening to the words, when the tone and the behaviors and the body is telling us a very different story. And this takes practice. This takes a lot of practice. But just like the mother is the external regulator of that baby's nervous system, the mother is tracking that baby's autonomic nervous system and empathically resonating so that she is reading with her body what the baby is feeling. So she's duplicating the rhythms in her body that the baby is experiencing. And so is the therapist. So is the therapist. We are replicating in our body when we are attuned to our patients, to our clients. We are replicating in our body the autonomic rhythms of our client's nervous system, right? This is what neuroscience is telling us when we are attuned, when we're attuning to them. We do it not just with our patients, not just in therapy, but we do it in relationships. Any relationship that you're attuned, person you're attuned to. So that the attuned therapist, the empathic therapist, is then also tracking beneath the words the autonomic rhythm of the patient, right? The intuitive rhythms that the therapist is picking up are playing out and are part of giving the experience to the patient that empathically you understand him. We understand them not just intellectually, but from inside. This is where empathy comes in and plays a role, right? What does empathy look like? It looks like walking into a room. This is perhaps controversial for a lot of behaviorists out there, right? But we're talking about complex trauma. We're talking about kids with severe abuse and neglect and trauma that has come from a place that is supposed to represent safety. That's how we define complex trauma in our last training session, right? This is very different. The source of the dysregulation is the attachment relationship. This is very different to environmental trauma, catastrophic trauma. So what does this empathy look like? It looks like walking into a room that's been absolutely trashed, right? Absolutely trashed. And on one hand, one could say, you can't do this. This is not okay. There are consequences for your behavior. Very true. Very true. You can't do that. That's illegal. That's a crime, right? If you're in a in a home, in a residential house, you've just trashed everything, you've cost a lot of money. Why did you do that? Second approach. Is this how you feel? What's going on? This is pretty bad. This is really bad. Empathy. The ability to empathically resonate with another person's experience is very different to just giving advice, telling them what to do or telling them what not to do. Our worlds are very different. Our world from their world, your world from their world, my world from their world. Whilst they are in a deeply painful, subjective world, we're in an objective world of verbalization, and it is actually hard to connect together. It is different and it is healing when you know that a person understands you from the inside and not just intellectually. And I think a lot of us can understand intellectually, but it is okay to understand with your heart from the inside. That is okay, because it just means that you're human. Studies have shown time and time again that the most powerful factor that cuts across all therapies is therapeutic alliance. Therapeutic alliance. The academic world has felt a little bit uncomfortable with this. How is therapeutic alliance better than this therapy? How is therapeutic alliance better than that therapy? That must be wrong. I was uncomfortable with this a long time ago. I didn't understand it. This ability of patient and therapist to co-create these emotional bonds, this empathy, as a relationship that allows the patient to feel safe enough. And that's what this is about. It's about creating safety. Patients feel better because they feel safe, and therefore they're able to explore situations and experiences that they may not be able to explore outside the safety of a relationship. So they feel safe enough to reveal whatever it is that they need to reveal, to share those parts of their private self with someone else, those scary parts with someone else, those deeply painful parts with someone else, those parts that they don't ever want to be exposed to again, that they've repressed, suppressed, try to forget, but for which the arousal is still there. And this relationship, this therapist relationship, or it doesn't have to be therapist, this other relationship between doctor and patient, between nurse and patient, between carer and patient, between caseworker and client, this relationship is not built on narrative. It's not built on words that are exchanged between those two people. It doesn't matter what is said. What matters is what's beneath the words. It is the information that is about their internal world, the information about their internal experiences, about their emotions, that is shared so effortlessly. It is shared so automatically between those two people, between the therapist, between the patient. And yes, I know this is troublesome for a lot of people in the academic world, but the more we learn about neuroscience, the more we accept this, the more we know how it is that relationships and allow for the brain to heal, particularly when it comes to complex trauma. We need to remember that many of these traumatic experiences are likely to have started very early on in development with the experience of trauma within very early attachment systems, right? So we're talking about these first 3 years, first 1,000 days of life, including the last trimester of pregnancy, right? And this period is dedicated to this right hemisphere development. The left being dominant for language, the right is dominant for processing emotions, the right is dominant for processing affect regulation, right? For processing information that is coming from the body, For nonverbal communication, just as the outcome of the early attachment is the communication of emotions, positive and negative, and the interactive regulation of emotions within the relationship of another human being, this is key in that critical early 3-year period in developing that child's self-regulating capacity throughout the lifespan. When we are now seeing that key to the work of trauma is not so much insight and cognition as much as it is to be able to communicate these emotional states, to be able to feel them in the body, to communicate these to another human being, for them to be regulated. The origins of trauma are in relationship. So what neuroscience is telling us is that the outcome of working with trauma has to be relational in nature. Traumatic experiences during these developmental period is stored not in explicit declarative memory, but in implicit procedural memory. That's where the psychopathology is taking its toll. So neuroscience argues that that's what the treatment must address. So how does this happen within a relationship? Like, we know that relationships are important, and we know now that because a lot of the trauma impacts a part of the brain that has to do with emotion regulation, that has to do with the relationship building and managing processing. What does that look like in therapy? In therapy, or in relationships with someone who is willing to take on this relational intervention, a big part of it is the external co-regulation of affect. Big part of it, external co-regulation of affect. So for example, one young person that I was seeing became extremely dysregulated whenever she had contact with her biological mother, because she just did not know what to expect. Her mother was a substance user who had been extremely violent, aggressive to this young person throughout her life, who had boyfriends who had sexually abused her, and she had allowed for that, abused her daughter. And so this young girl was very, very aggressive and very violent following contact with her mother, because she just didn't know what to expect. Sometimes she would have a phone call and it would be nice. I love you. I can't wait to have you back. You mean the world to me, which is what every child wants to hear from their mother, that they wanted, that they loved. Those were very few times, but enough for her to hold on to those and to feel and hope that maybe the next phone call will be the same. But they weren't the same. And most of them were actually quite terrifying. Sometimes she just wouldn't pick up the phone. Sometimes she would pick up the phone and she would be extremely abusive, intoxicated, and would say some pretty awful things, some horrible things. And so we just never knew what we would expect from contact. And we would prepare this young person. A lot of therapy went into preparing her and helping her, build the reserve within her nervous system to tolerate the arousal associated with, mum's rejection or mum's unpredictability. And I mean, one of the things that helped was a social story, so that we could actually make the unpredictability predictable. Today I'm going to call my mum. Sometimes my mum is really nice. Sometimes my mum says these things. Other times mum says that. And when this happens, these are some of the strategies. Yes, we did do CBT. What are some green thoughts that help? What are some red thoughts to watch out for? What are some behavioral interventions? So after I see my mum, what are some of the things that can help me calm down? My favorite sensory toy, what music will play, etc., etc. We had that. But that was just an add-on to the real therapeutic work. And that is, after she had the phone call, being available and sitting with her so that I could be the external co-regulator of that affect, because she, after that phone call, whatever it was, there would be a lot of arousal there that her nervous system would really struggle to contain. And there really needs to be that connection with that mature, more robust nervous system that will be able to co-regulate through that critical period, so that over time she can build that reserve. And so this is an example of how relationships can help within that regulation framework. I remember there was another time when I walked into this young person who had engaged in some superficial self-harm. As superficial as it was one of the first times that I had seen, blood and cuts, and didn't look very nice. And this was actually quite early on, and I didn't know what to do. But I just sat with her. So I just sat with her. It was not a medical emergency. It was looked after. It was within an inpatient context. So there was no risk. But I knew that she must have been feeling pretty awful to do what she did. And so I just sat with her for about 2 hours. And I don't know why. It just happened. But looking back, I remember just thinking, that was actually quite therapeutic. There was a lot of external co-regulation of affect in that moment. But again, there are behaviorists out there that are going to be saying you're reinforcing that. You're welcome. You're welcome to think that, and I can definitely see where that's coming from. I just think that when you, in the context of complex trauma, in the context of someone being so incredibly dysregulated and really needing to feed off that robust nervous system, where you need that right brain to right brain communication, it's interesting because it's actually what a parent would do with a child when they're feeling that distress. They would sit with them and try to help them work through it. And I think that's definitely very therapeutic. Relationship, empathy, attunement, and the external co-regulation of affect play a big role in the healing of young people who have experienced complex trauma. We'll have different opinions, and that's okay. If you're watching this, you are probably someone who is very interested in the topic. Read more about it, form your own opinion, whatever you feel comfortable with. So long as you have a rationale that is evidence-based, such as neuroscience and the evidence that we know about affect regulation and complex trauma and the part of the brain that it affects, etc. And so long as you feel comfortable with doing so, then you should feel confident and give yourself permission to experience empathy, to develop a relationship, to definitely be attuned, to listen with your body, and definitely listen beneath the words to the affect that is so effortlessly and intuitively shared beneath the words. Don't get stuck on the narrative. Don't get stuck on those words. Remember, language is the most misleading form of communication. Listen to what's beneath the words and listen with your body. So another approach, another thing to remember is to understand dysregulation. What do we actually know about dysregulation? I've got a little video I want to show you on this, and I think it's enough. It's really helpful. So here it is.
Hey, welcome back everyone. Today I want to talk about the Incredible Hulk and why I use the Incredible Hulk metaphor for nearly all my patients with trauma. because it's one of the best metaphors for understanding how trauma impacts the brain, how we think, how we feel, and how we react to different situations. And it also has some clues about how to actually help people recover from trauma. So everyone knows that the Incredible Hulk is one of America's favorite superheroes. But did you know that he actually has a severe history of childhood abuse at the hands of his father? And so Bruce Banner always had this huge capacity for rage as a way to protect himself from perceived threat. But then when he got infected with gamma radiations, it turned his rage into one of the most powerful forces in the universe. And we all know that as he starts to get angry, his eyes turn green, his skin turns green, and he starts to grow muscles at an incredible rate. As his Hulk starts to come up, his capacity for intelligence goes way down. And as the Hulk is raging, there's this underlying sense of self-hatred because Banner hates turning into the Hulk. The rest of the world tries to stop the Hulk by sending the world's military against him, but every time you shoot the Hulk or threaten him, it just makes him absorb more gamma radiation, become stronger and stronger, and probably less and less smart. And the only thing that can help the Hulk calm down is actually to just be done with his rage, destroy the threat, and then go jump to South America or some other beautiful place and take a nap for a day and a half, and then wake up and realize that you've tattered your clothes and you probably left a wake of destruction, and you have to find your way back to civilization. Now, there's a really important lesson about managing kids who Hulk out too. The thing that the world usually does whenever they see a child acting out and hulking out is that they threaten consequences to them. And this is exactly like shooting the Hulk with military weapons. I mean, the more you shoot at the Hulk, you just make him stronger and stronger and madder and madder. And this is what happens to all these kids who are raging out. Everyone sends them to timeouts or threatens consequences and takes away privileges, and it just makes them escalate more and more. And then we end up classifying them as the problem, as having rage and anger issues, when in fact, they just have this overreactive alarm system that operates just like the way that the Hulk's does. And so you're going to ask, okay, then what do we do with the Hulk? Now, the first thing you have to do is actually to never let the Hulk come out in the first place. And the way you do that is by strengthening Banner's capacity for self-awareness, to know what triggers him, and to recognize when he's starting to get mad. Because when his eyes are green, maybe there's a little bit of capacity for controlling that reaction to become full-blown Hulk. And you also try to help give Banner other skills for dealing with anger and aggression. But at the same time, Banner sometimes needs the Hulk because there are real threats out there, so you can't really hate the Hulk when he comes out. You just have to know when to use him. And then when the Hulk is out, there's really not much you can do. And even for traumatized people, as soon as the sympathetic nervous system is activated and the whole stress response is activated, it's going to take a good 45 minutes to an hour for the body to metabolize all of that adrenaline that's coursing through the body. And this is why I like chill out spaces for schools, just a place where kids can go and feel safe and try to calm themselves back down. Now, the other thing you can do when Banner's eyes are green and he still has some capacity to think is to make him focus on what really matters most in this moment. And particularly if you make him focus on who matters most to you, who do you love, what do you care about most in this world, then sometimes it can help de-escalate him down from turning into the Hulk completely.
Goodbye. Goodbye, David. And I hope you find your safe place. Your refuge.
Thank you.
Next, understanding shame. One emotion that always accompanies trauma is shame. And shame is essentially to hide from others, but even from oneself. So a big part of any work with trauma is about loosening up these boundaries of shame. And you know what? This is actually hard work. There are times when they will disengage, and you have like this hiding mechanism that comes into play. Dissociation is so common, and it's when we cut ourselves from the body. That's what dissociation is. Dissociation is about cutting ourselves from the body, cutting ourselves from the emotions. It's a defense against trauma. We have to understand defense mechanisms, which will actually, that's the next bit as well. But shame often brings on a lot of these defense mechanisms, but they're all elements of regulation, right? So in therapy will do the healing, because we have we're constantly regulating our internal states by our relationships. So being aware of shame, but also being aware that it is through relationships that we are constantly co-regulating each other's affects. But yes, so shame is an extremely powerful emotion. It will come into play when you're seeing young people with complex trauma histories. Moving on to communication. I guess this ties in a lot with what I was saying before about listening beneath the words, trying to identify what they're communicating to us through means other than language, right? And that can be very, very powerful. And so this next strategy or approach to working with young people with complex trauma, it's about communication. What does your behavior tell me about the world that you come from, about your world? So when you walk into a session and the young person immediately draws attention to something, completely non-related. Hey, look at that couch. That is an awesome looking couch. Look at that fabric. I love it. Blah, 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 blah. Are they really talking to us about the couch? My interpretation of that would be, okay, that's all right. Don't worry. We're not going to talk about really difficult things. We can talk about the couch. That is a really good looking couch. I just want you to know that you can tell me. You can tell me, you know what? I don't want to talk about anything today. I just want to sit with you. I just want to draw with you. I just want to do this and that with you. And that's absolutely okay. I often find that young people are constantly communicating about safety, whether they feel safe, whether they don't, and they do it in ways that are very puzzling, but then again also make sense. If a behavior just doesn't make sense, it's probably because they're trying to communicate, something that's safety related. I remember seeing this one young person who kept presenting to our ED every 2 days, every 3 days. And it was a difficult person to like by many people because this young person actually very much came across as attention seeking. I actually don't like that. Actually, that's something I need to let everybody know. I don't like the idea or the phrase attention seeking. I don't work with that because these kids are not attention seeking. They could be nurture seeking. That's for me, how I interpret that behavior, and I think it really makes a difference in terms of our formulation. Some people have used the term attachment seeking. That's okay. Safety seeking is actually what I like to use most. Are they safety seeking? Are they nurture seeking? Are they attachment seeking? Relationship seeking? And that's a lot of the communication and the behaviors will be about communicating that need. Like I was saying before, I have this young person who kept coming to our emergency department every 2 to 3 days, and she was quite unlikable because she was labeled as attention seeking because she would take photos and video herself in the ambulance or on her way going to our ED. This was many years ago. And it just really acted in a way that I could definitely understand why people would get frustrated with her when she presented. And so, the term borderline was thrown around a lot. And, whether true or not, the one thing that stayed in my mind was that there are many borderlines out there. Why is she here every second day? Why is she here so often? What's going on? What is she running away from? What is her behavior telling me about what's happening in her world? And she was running away from something very, very awful that was happening to her. But this is what I mean by communication. A lot of these kids will engage in safety-seeking behavior, in nurture-seeking behavior. And it's important for us to identify that behavior because sometimes it's the only way that they have to communicate that. I want to talk about contact here for a little bit, contact between a child that is in out-of-home care and the perpetrating family member. A lot of young people in out-of-home care who present to our emergency department do so just before contact with the biological parent, because there is a lot of controversy around contact, particularly with parents, especially because these kids want contact with their parents, with perpetrating parents. Very few kids will say no to their parents, right? But then a day or two before they have contact, they light a fire at a store, or they run away from placement, or they commit a crime and they get locked up. And it just seems to happen time and time again. They get into a fight and they get brought into ED for a mental health assessment, escorted by police, very dysregulated. What is that behavior telling us? It's telling us that the arousal associated with that contact that's coming is probably too much and too overwhelming for them to contain. Sometimes it's a recommendation that contact be pulled back, that contact be ceased, or that contact be supervised. They're saying they want to see them, and a lot of them do say that they want to see them. And then with their behavior, they communicate that this is really hard for them. But they get thrown into a situation where they have very little capacity to contain the arousal associated with that trauma. Remember, complex trauma is where the source of the dysregulation is coming from that relationship. That attachment figure is the source of that dysregulation, the source of the trauma. The trauma is originating from the place that is supposed to represent protection and safety. So just like with any trauma, what would happen if someone keeps being re-triggered? A lot of these kids are saying, whether it's substantiated or not, right? If the child has voiced a trauma that is associated with that person, then they will be re-triggered. They are being thrown back into that trauma. They are being exposed to that trauma through contact. And so in that instance, that behavior is very telling that they're finding it very difficult. And often, I understand, contact is important. Usually the point of contact is for nurture. If contact doesn't have a nurture purpose, or if nurture is not happening, then what are we actually doing and exposing this child to? And I'm not suggesting cancel contact altogether, although in some cases I really do think that's necessary, right? Because through their behavior, the child is screaming, I can't do this, I don't feel safe, this is the brainstem, I'm gonna light a fire because you're making me see my dad on the weekend and he did all these awful things to me, but I can't say no to him, right? I've made all the reports, it wasn't substantiated, but you're still making me see him on the weekend. So I'm gonna do this. And sometimes I don't even do it on purpose or deliberately. Sometimes I do, trying to get away from the situation. But other times it's just arousal that they just don't know how to contain. The bigger the arousal, the bigger the behavior, the bigger their attempt to try to contain that level of arousal. And so if we're going to throw kids into that level of arousal, if we think for whatever reason in that particular relationship that this is important, then we need to support both the parent and the child, right? In this contact. We don't just throw the child into the deep end so he can deal with the trauma week and week and week and week again, and then blame the child for doing all these awful things that they're doing, right? So a lot of therapy in building regulation skills, a lot of work with the parents in teaching them how to connect better with that child, supervised contact, so that, you know, we know that everything that happens within that relationship or within that contact is safe. Often children will behave in these ways because they do not feel safe. So a lot of these behaviors are about safety, and they're often communicating that they don't feel safe. So something else to remember is what is it that these kids are communicating to us about the world that they come from, about their interactions, and more often than not, it's really about, you know, looking for safety, looking for nurture. So there are unique forms of defenses that are used in young people, adults, anyone really with complex trauma. In early relational trauma, any trauma really, there are two patterns that the infant can move into when all of a sudden trauma begins, right? And these are hyperarousal, which are high amounts of extreme fear, terror, aggression, etc. That's one. And we know that over time, if these continue and become overwhelming, the animal brain will actually shut down, because the infant is overwhelmed beyond its coping capacity, and suddenly the infant will now dissociate. So the infant is totally gone, right? And so the infant has gone from hyperarousal to hypoarousal. And this is a shutdown of a metabolic state. This is a complete shutdown of metabolic state. So we are looking at a collapse of the right brain, right? In instances of severe suicide, for example. So we're going from aggression, huge aggression, to a complete shutdown where there is a real drop in metabolic energy. And without this metabolic energy, many of the functions are also gone. And so the affect that accompanies the collapse of the right brain is just intense hopelessness and helplessness. And this is dissociation. It is so primitive, but it's there to help these young people survive. It's just amazing what you will do to survive. And when you are going to work with people with like really severe trauma, you're going to see some very primitive defense mechanisms. Let's talk about reenactment. Reenactment occurs under severe stress, and trauma can reappear in reenactment, and we can also call this repetition compulsion. In therapy, the reenactment will occur within the therapeutic alliance. Sometimes the attachment dynamics will be re-expressed in the therapy, but only if there is enough safety and trust. Enough safety and trust that has been built by the therapeutic alliance, so that the patient now allows themselves to go into this place that they had always been highly defensive of. But now there's enough safety, there's enough trust, and they drop the defenses so that they can allow themselves to feel some of that pain. They drop the dissociation. They don't dissociate anymore. They reenact. And they begin to express it towards another human being. And actually, this allows for treatment. It's very, very hard to identify, you know, and some people will say, well, how do you know it's not just learned behavior? It's on a case by case. And I think you really need to know the context of the trauma. You need to know the trauma. You need to know that child, that therapist. You need to have a really good relationship. They need to feel really safe. And, you know, I've seen and identify elements of reenactment between carer and the young person, with me as well in sessions, when they're trying to tell me something. Often this young person will reenact a situation or a trauma, and that's their way of communicating to you what's happened. But they will do it from the perpetrator's point of view because it's safer for them to reenact a trauma where they now are the perpetrator. It can be very healing as well. This whole idea of reenactment is actually quite complex, and I'm more than happy to discuss with you face to face, more examples, and it's cases where I've seen reenactment in my practice, and it can be anywhere from changing dynamics between a young person and their carer, to full-blown behaviors and reenactment of pretty horrific trauma. So this is the one thing that I guess is controversial about this is, how do you know it's reenactment? They're not telling you I'm reenacting. It's really about knowing that context and knowing that history, about hypothesizing, what is the purpose and the function. And the reason why it is important is because if we identify it as reenacting, then we respond to it very differently as if we identify it as a misbehavior or an assault or an abuse behavior towards someone else. It makes a big difference, because on one hand, if it's a reenactment, what it's actually suggesting is that the relationship is so safe, they are now ready to process that trauma, right? And often in the reenactment, they take on the role of the perpetrator. In that instance, for example, our response would be to try to work through that trauma and try to regulate the affect associated with that trauma, to help them through the external co-regulation of affect, how to process the trauma that they now feel safe enough to communicate to us. From a different point of view, what if it's not a reenactment? Then our response would be very different. There would be consequences for that behavior. There might be, if you keep doing that to this carer, we're going to remove that carer. We're going to put a new carer in there. If you respond in that way, and that was reenactment, if that was that young person's attempt at trying to communicate the trauma with that person because they felt safe enough, then how therapeutic is that response? So this is where, within your team, within different professionals involved in the care are very complex. This is happening when trauma, in cases of severe trauma, you see quite a lot of reenactment, and through good knowledge of that history, of that complex trauma history, the therapist plays a big role here, because that therapist will have that relationship to know, is this out of character for this young person? Is this likely to be a reenactment? Is this just, is this behavioral in nature? Tricky to disentangle, but incredibly powerful therapeutically if you can identify it and not be scared of it. So that's the end of our second training session. I hope you got something out of it. It's not about telling you what works. It's not about telling you what to do. It's about sharing with you my formulation of how I approach complex trauma, of what research underpins my strategies, of what my experience has been with working with a lot of these young people, and sharing with you so that you can, decide what you want to try, what you don't, what you want to read more about, and feel free to contact me so that we can discuss at length some of the things that were of interest to you, some of the things that you might not be so sure about. that would be great. I would love to do that. I really hope it was helpful. We've got a few more training sessions. See you next time.